Angelina Jolie's quote, which came on early in the conflict, where she said that this is the deliberate bombing of a trapped population who has nowhere to flee. Gaza has been an open-air prison for nearly 2 decades.
Many years ago. And so for decades, there was sort of unanimous consensus between Republicans and Democrats when it came to this position. There was a general consensus taking a very, very strong, staunch pro-Israeli stance on these issues. And any view that was against that general narrative, the consensus, it was very, very difficult to pass. That Israel doesn't need the United States needs Israel. And so those kinds of comments, or even comments in which she says that the Palestinians should in fact all be transferred. This is a candidate running for president to say that she fully supports the transfer, which of course is a euphemism for ethnic cleansing, to suggest that and yet not be condemned.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Amina. I'm here with a new episode of New Wave Global. As the Israel-Palestine conflict enters its 109th day, it's gone past the 100-day mark, it still continues to remain on the forefront of the world news. The conflict has touched almost every region of the world in one way or another. Nothing remains untouched, but unfortunately, there's still no end in sight. To discuss the current situation and the landscape of the conflict, I have with me today Professor Farid Senzai. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for joining me.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you so much, Amina, for the invitation. I look forward to our conversation.
Of course. And just a quick introduction for Professor Senzai. He's a professor of political science and international relations at Santa Clara University. He teaches courses on U.S. foreign policy and Middle East politics. He's also the founder and president of Afghan Relief, which is a humanitarian organization which is dedicated to helping the most vulnerable in Afghanistan. So he has a soft corner for the vulnerable populations in the world. Prior to starting this relief organization, he was the founder and president of the Center for Global Policy, a think tank in Washington, D.C. that focuses on U.S. relations with the Muslim world. He was also a co-founder and director of research at the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, where he conducted extensive research projects on Muslims in America. He was also a research associate at Brookings Institute and a research analyst at the Council on Foreign Relations. He was also on the board of advisors at the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life and a board member at the Central Asia Institute. So that defines the breadth of his experience. He received his master's in international affairs from Columbia University and has a PhD in politics and international relations from Oxford University. Wow, quite an achievement, Professor Senzai. Thank you again for joining me. So like I was mentioning, that this is an ongoing conflict. It is still occupying the world's attention, which is obviously a great thing because we want this conflict to come to a conclusion since there is an ongoing loss of innocent lives. I'd like to pretext our conversation by Angelina Jolie's quote, which came on early in the conflict, where she said that this is the deliberate bombing of a trapped population who has nowhere to flee. Gaza has been an open-air prison for nearly 2 decades. That's kind of important for us to remember, that it just did not start on October 7th. There's a whole pretext to this conflict and is becoming a mass grave. 40% of those are innocent children, while the world watches and with the active support of many governments. So this is mostly not just Israel, but it is endorsed by many governments in the world. But as we have moved along since October 7th, I feel like that there has been at least a slight shift in the narrative of the conversation. Just like recently, we had Bernie Sanders' a resolution which was asking to force a State Department report on Israeli human rights violation in Gaza. Unfortunately, that, as we all are aware, that resolution received support of only 17 senators, and it was basically bombed. It was tabled, and kind of met an early demise. But the fact that it was actually presented, it seems to be quite a change in the narrative since we began. I would just like to get your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I think you've addressed a number of issues. We can hopefully talk about all of them in terms of the context of this conflict, how it's evolved, not only in the last 100+ days, but for decades in terms of how this conflict has been moving, as well as the way that it's perceived, both in the United States and internationally. The resolution, of course, that Senator Sanders had attempted to pass was one in which there was a hope that that human rights violation, international law, could be brought to bear on what Israel was doing, and then how the State Department would respond to that. That was the hope. The fact that you did have, I think it was 11 senators, you mentioned 17, I believe it was 11 that.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, it was 11.
That 11 senators that supported that. It's more than what might have happened many years ago. And so for decades, there was sort of unanimous consensus between Republicans and Democrats when it came to this position. There was a general consensus taking a very, very strong, staunch pro-Israeli stance on these issues. And any view that was against that general narrative, the consensus, it was very, very difficult to pass. The fact that we do have slow cracks or small cracks in this dam, and it's slowly beginning to emerge, both on the House side and in the Senate, suggests that things are changing. But as you can see, we still have a long ways to go. And politics in America are continued to be instrumental in supporting the Israeli position, which is why you see the kinds of atrocities that Israel is committing with U.S. support. So things are slowly changing, but we still have a very long way before there's enough momentum from the general public in the United States, and that translates into pressure on members of Congress, both in the House and in the Senate, to really begin to change the way that they act in terms of policy questions, and that then will begin to change the way the U.S. Deals with this conflict more generally. So it's steps in the right direction, but we still have a very, very long way to go.
Rightly said. Just kind of to present both sides of the picture, like you said, the representatives. My understanding is at the moment there are at least more than 70 representatives who have called for ceasefire. But on the other hand, just going back to that resolution, Mitch McConnell, the minority leader, actually said in response to that resolution that Israel deserves America's firm support as it roots out terrorist killers and restores its security. Another senator from Delaware, which was actually a Democrat, says that he cannot support risking the suspension of all U.S. assistance and publicly rebuking Israel in a way that could embolden its enemies. So despite the fact that we have moved some, it seems like that there's still very, very strong support, regardless of what's happening to the Palestinian population.
Absolutely. And the thing is that this is the general consensus, even among Democrats, and even some of the most progressive Democrats. I mean, Ro Khanna, who represents us here in the Bay Area, one would think is very progressive on so many issues, but still, it took him a very long time to then support the ceasefire. This was a number of conversations. I, including, had conversations with him. Others had spoken to him. Eric Swalwell, who's another representative here in the Bay Area, same thing, progressive on so many issues. We've had numerous conversations with him, but yet still till today has not come forward to support the ceasefire. Even Bernie Sanders on the Senate side took a long time to finally come to a conclusion. There was a lot of pressure put on him that why wasn't he? And initially he was talking about temporary humanitarian in stopping the fighting, but it was always seen as temporary. And so it's come a long ways. I think because the war has continued for so long, the devastation has been so monumental, and that has really changed the perception that these progressive has slowly started to have regarding the war. But those in the center, those that, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, people like President Biden and others, whether it's Hillary Clinton, for instance, or even President Obama, who's not come out and forcefully made a strong statement on this, that suggests that this is where politics still are in the United States. And so it's some of the more progressive individuals that are speaking out, but the majority of Democrats, let alone, of course, Republicans, will staunchly stand on the side of Israel. And then, of course, you have individuals like Nikki Haley, who's running for president. She's probably second in the lead after Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And she says things like, we should never give a red line to Israel, and that, that the United States doesn't, that Israel doesn't need the United States needs Israel. And so those kinds of comments, or even comments in which she says that the Palestinians should in fact all be transferred. This is a candidate running for president to say that she fully supports the transfer, which of course is a euphemism for ethnic cleansing, to suggest that, and yet not be condemned, and yet supported by a vast segment of the political elite and the general public, says a lot about where we still are in regards to this conflict.
Truly so. So moving on from the national US scene, if we look internationally, we've also recently seen South Africa's case against Israel in the International Court of Justice at The Hague for alleged violations of genocide convention. I know that both sides have presented their cases. We're still waiting on a final decision. But what it seems like is that South Africa is basically hoping for some provisional concessions, and they're asking that, at least the court asks for a ceasefire or a halt in military operations, and while it establishes plausibility of actually violations of the Genocide Convention. And that's one example, which is a huge deal from any country to have presented such a case against Israel. What is your perspective on that? And then the international support versus not support for this Palestinian conditions?
Well, it's a very important milestone in where we are with South Africa. I mean, you think about the country that made the case. South Africa, of all countries, has that credibility, a country that dealt with apartheid and is coming to it to suggest that, and in fact, one of the most important things about the South African case was it brought in this context to say, look, this isn't just about what happened on October 7th and since then, but in fact, let's look at decades of occupation, decades of military suppression of Palestinians, and not to mention the ongoing attacks and wars that have happened. That was all brought in, and then including the context of apartheid, which is a word now is increasingly being used in the context of Israel. So all of that was brought to bear in the case for South Africa. Clearly, you saw that this was an important step, because something like this had not happened before. It is the highest court internationally. It is a court that many countries now since have come forward in terms of this case to support, and therefore it is quite significant. This case alone is quite significant. Now, whether it actually goes through and the case is one that is supported by the court, politics comes in. And so while the legal merits may be there, and I think South Africa made a very, very strong, compelling case that genocide, the acts of genocide was taking place, and the intent was there. So both of those factors were there. So they made a very strong case, but politics are still involved. And so at the end of the day, you have countries that have to, while they don't necessarily represent the views of that particular countries, but the judges there are from various countries, and
Yeah.
politics are still in play. And you have to have 8 of those judges support the motion for this to go through. And many that I've spoken to, including legal experts on international law, suggest that it's close. They have somewhere between 7 to possibly 8 or 9 that might be there, but 8 are necessary. So if you end up with less than 8, then it obviously would not be supported.
But having said that, even if we assume for a second that they meet that they get to that number, magic number of 8, Netanyahu has already said that Israel would not be stopped by The Hague in restoring security to its land. So it seems like that it doesn't matter whether the ruling goes for or against them. They have set their mind on continuing on with the conflict and not care about the consequences. What do you take?
Well, there's so many factors at play in terms of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's own calculation about proceeding. The domestic nature of this, Netanyahu, many suggest, will not survive once the war is over. So once the war is over, he's likely to be replaced, that they will in fact call for elections, the parliamentary system, they'll call for elections, and therefore he will be removed. And so the last thing he wants is for the war to end. He knows that once the war is end, he's likely he'll be finished as a politician. And then of course there's indictments against him. And so he's looking at it in many ways for his own personal survival, even to the point that you mentioned earlier, this idea of releasing the hostages, for instance, is one that he's not inclined to support, because he knows that if Hamas releases the hostages, and in turn then Israelis have to release prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, that is likely to lead to a ceasefire, an end to the war. And then once again, Netanyahu comes under the microscope. He's likely to be removed from office. So all of these in place suggest that it's in his own personal interest for this war to continue. So whether it's The Hague in international pressure, or it's domestic pressure to release the hostages, he wants this war to continue. Not only does he want this current war to continue, he would love nothing more than for the war to be expanded, for others to be included, which is what's happening. And so the targeting attacks in Syria, for instance, or in Lebanon, or you see it, in Iran or in Yemen, you're seeing these attempts to, in fact, expand the war into a regional conflict, because the hope is that that regional conflict will bring in the United States. And once the U.S. is brought in, then, of course, it makes a much more difficult and complicates the issues, which then Netanyahu hopes he will be able to sort of survive that consequence. So in many ways, it's really about self-preservation and his own legacy, an individual who prided himself or insisted that, in fact, he was going to provide security to Israel, which clearly was not the case. And now he's being attacked from all fronts because of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. In fact, it's appalling that you would want this conflict to go on for personal benefit. You briefly mentioned or actually touched on this, that probably Israeli government, or maybe just Prime Minister Netanyahu is hoping for the spread of the conflict, and then maybe getting U.S. involved too. But from the optics standpoint, going back to that case, let's see, we hit that magic number. There's a ruling against Israel, and Netanyahu goes on to proceed, like he proclaimed, that he would continue the conflict and continue to protect the security of its land. Do you think it would become harder for U.S. to actually stand behind and support its action after International Court of Justice has ruled against them, or found them guilty maybe of violating the Genocide Convention?
Absolutely. there's so many things that happen if that case proceeds. If it proceeds and genocide is then attributed to the conflict, and to suggest that Israel is now is complicit in committing just genocide, and the U.S. Then of course the U.S. is going to be targeted, because South Africa, in fact, has an intention to go after the United States. So many things then begin to unravel, because even European countries that generally have stood in support of Israel, the European Union and many individual countries then will be put under a tremendous amount of pressure to say, now, in fact, do you continue to support a country that has been implicated in genocide, that genocide is something that is being committed in this current conflict? It changes the dynamic, not to mention the international community then begins to act on that in a number of different ways, whether it's trade relations change, sanctions get put on, boycotting. All of these things begin to change the dynamic. And that's what Israel is going to face, because, you know, just like the word apartheid, which is one that for decades people only used in the context of South Africa. Now, in fact, after Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International put out the reports, including B'Tselem, which is the Israeli human rights organization, they both, all three of them, put out the reports to suggest that apartheid Israel is engaged in in acts of apartheid against Palestinians. That attachment, that word attached to Israel, is now very difficult to shed. That's now permanently part of the narrative discussion when it comes to this conflict. The same will happen with the question of genocide. Genocide then can't just be washed away. It's not something that can be ignored or looked the other way. And so regardless of how Israel then responds and how Benjamin Netanyahu responds, genocide will always be attached to this conflict. And then what you'll also see is increasingly domestic pressure within Israel, even though generally the consensus is very staunchly supportive of this war, including the majority of Israelis that say that not enough force has been used, which is really remarkable, but that's the case. What's going to happen is you're going to begin to hear voices within Israel from the left and more progressive voices in the country that are going to say, look, we cannot continue this, especially after the case that South Africa has made on genocide. And so you begin to see the domestic pressures put in place. Now, in terms of what happens in the United States, I think that the dynamic will change. As I said, there will be pressure put from the general public on members of Congress, and slowly you'll begin to see this this gap that's taking place begin to widen, and you'll begin to see more and more support among members of the House as well as within the Senate, because they will then say, look, this is what has been argued and the case has been made. It's going to become more and more difficult for the staunch supporters of Israel to continue to make the case to pursue and then, of course, militarily support this war, because ultimately the U.S. is the one that continues to arm Israel in this ongoing conflict.
Yes. So, and you had briefly alluded to this point too, about how there's now an actual buildup of domestic pressure too. I know there's an ongoing international effort in trying to persuade Israel on a ceasefire. But as far as the domestic pressure goes, I know, we know that there have been ongoing talks on the diplomatic fronts, and Egyptians and Qataris have been trying to serve as intermediaries. And it seems like the most recent effort was to ask Israel for a permanent ceasefire in exchange for return of all the hostages of the October 7th incidents. And it seems like that there was a blatant refusal to even consider a permanent ceasefire. So obviously, there has been quite an uproar about that from within Israel itself. And then just yesterday was the deadliest day in terms of IDF forces losing, the number is 21 to 24 soldiers. That's the deadliest day that they've seen so far, although it compares nothing to the loss of life that Palestinians have suffered. But it seems like, that is also not going down well with IDF or Israeli population itself. So how do you feel that is going to impact Israel's government decision on continuing with the conflict?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I think that many initially, when the war started, there was a tremendous amount of anger across the board in Israel on what happened on October 7th. There was this desire to respond, desire to seek revenge against those who had committed the violent acts in Israel. And so, certainly you saw support, very, very strong support for dealing with it. And therefore all means necessary should be used. And that's why you had the kinds of statements that, we will eliminate Hamas, we will destroy Hamas, we will not leave any building, standing, we will sort of destroy and demolish, even to the point where some individuals in the government were saying that we're going to nuke the entire region, all of Gaza. So these kinds of statements were being made with, of course, the hope from their standpoint that it could be done relatively quickly and Hamas could be eliminated, removed, and the war could end. Clearly, that's not what happened. And anyone who understands the politics in the region, as well as Palestinian politics, and understands that the struggle of the Palestinians have been going on for decades, this was just a far-fetched pipe dream that they thought that Hamas could be removed in such a way. In fact, as all the polls have suggested, that Hamas is much stronger today than before October 7th. And polls that were taken during the temporary ceasefire, for instance, or the temporary fighting when it stopped, was polls were taken, and Palestinians, both in the West Bank, in particular the West Bank, but also in Gaza, began to support Hamas. And so Hamas's support gained momentum, not to mention an entire generation of young Palestinians that have lost their family, lost their siblings, lost their parents. And so you have a whole new generation that will continue the struggle and continue to fight back and used armed resistance against the Israelis. So it was really just a pipe dream that Israeli government officials had, to think that somehow this war would end quickly. Now that it's gone on for so long and the hostages remain, now you are beginning to hear louder voices. And for the first time, you're in fact even beginning to see protests in the streets in Israel, in which Israelis are going out and protesting. And you have people that are voicing their protests. They're still being reprimanded, or in some cases fired from their position. Journalists, of course, that are critical are being removed. There's all of these things that are taking place, but the dynamic is changing in Israel. And as I think, is if this war continues for weeks, if not months, moving forward, it will begin to change the internal dynamic within Israel. There will be a tremendous amount of pressure to have the hostages returned. And of course, Hamas has continued to say that, all for all, and therefore we'll release the hostages if all the Palestinian prisoners are also released, which of course, as I said, Prime Minister Netanyahu refuses to do.
Thank you. So now that we've briefly touched on the domestic front, the international front, and also the home front, home being US for us, would you like to sum up this whole conflict in the context of what is happening currently? Do you feel that we're seeing winds of change and the tide is turning, and we can hope for a favorable conclusion to this conflict in upcoming weeks, hopefully?
Well, I think that there's a number of things that are really important to consider. On the one hand, this conflict, as I said, the current conflict is likely to continue. It's likely to continue because Prime Prime Minister Netanyahu wishes for it to continue, even though you are starting to see some pressure put on by the Biden administration, because as we near elections, the 2024 elections in the United States, you're beginning to see, especially since this is not going well for President Biden, that in fact, if he continues to support Israel as he's done, he's going to continue to lose domestic support among the general public, especially a younger generation, especially among Arabs, Americans, and Muslim Americans in key states like Michigan and elsewhere. So all of that is going to put a lot of pressure on President Biden to start to change the rhetoric and the way that he has dealt with this conflict. That will likely change the dynamic with Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's likely, especially if real pressure is put on, he's likely to feel it and begin to change the way he's dealing with it. But as I said, if it's up to him and if the pressure does not come to bear from the United States, then he will continue it for a very, very long time. So there's that issue about this conflict in terms of where we are in the last 107 or 108 days since the war began. Now, in terms of the conflict more broadly, things are changing. I mean, I've been dealing with and a student of this conflict and teaching this topic for 25 years. And in 25 years, you know, there was a certain view and narrative about this conflict. Most people were not particularly informed or interested in it. You're starting to see that there's a tremendous amount of interest. I mean, just in the past 3 months, I mean, since the conflict started, the number of people that have requested talks about this, conversations about this, presentations about this, discussions about this, not to mention the way that it's available on social media. Now it's all out in the open. It's very difficult for those that support Israel and those that have an interest in sort of curtailing the way that this narrative is portrayed and shown to the world. That is changing. That dynamic is changing. And as the world begins to hear about it, it's changing the way that people perceive this conflict. And so from that standpoint, in the 25 years that I've been dealing with this region and this conflict in particular, I'm starting to see real change starting to take place. And that's going to change the way that the conflict continues in the years ahead, if not the decades ahead, as well as the way that the international community sees it, the kinds of pressure that Israel is going to be put under, the microscope that it'll be put under, including the way that Israel continues to pursue its occupation long-term. Because the reality is this occupation, which has gone on for 70 plus years, this occupation cannot be sustained over the long term. The dynamic has changed, especially now. Most people wanted a two-state solution. I was a staunch supporter of the two-state solution for decades, but now it's quite clear, it's quite evident that even those that were supportive of the two-state solution understand that the two-state solution is no longer possible, that in fact we have a one-state reality. Israel controls and dominates all aspects of life between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, including all those that live there. And this is 7.1 million Jews and 7.1 million Palestinians. So they're even in population. And so what happens is now, if a two-state solution is not possible, and you may have heard, of course, recently in the last weeks or two, that Prime Minister Netanyahu has made it clear, quite sort of openly, saying that I no longer support the two-state solution. Well, it was evident he'd never supported it for 30 years, but it was always privately he would say it, or we understood that's how he believed, but now he's openly saying it. So the more that Israel takes this view that they no longer support the two-state solution, the dynamics changes. And so if two-state isn't supported and the international community agrees that two states is no longer possible, and the U.S. no longer continues to support the notion of a two-state solution, then what are you left with? Well, you're left with a one-state reality. And that one-state reality then either an apartheid state, and therefore then it's labeled clearly and everyone agrees that it's fully an apartheid state. The U.S. then fully begins to see it as an apartheid state. Or you end up giving equality to everybody between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, at which point then all Jews, all Palestinians have freedom, equality, self-determination, the right to then dictate and decide what their future should look like. That's the other alternative. The third alternative, of course, which is one that Israel would like to pursue, because clearly the first two options, neither one of them are favorable to Israel. The third one is to ethnically cleanse and the Palestinians out, to say basically, we wish to retain control over all of the land, but we do not wish to have any of the Palestinians there, whether it's in Gaza and eventually, of course, in the West Bank and elsewhere. And so the removal of Palestinians from this land that they're indigenous to, that then is what Israel wants. And so now all this talk about, sending them to Egypt or to Turkey or Yemen and to Iraq, or European countries and others should take in, or Nikki Haley saying, yes, they should just be transferred. I mean, this is sort of the view of the staunch right in Israel and, in fact, of evangelical Christians in the United States that continue to support this view. So those are the three options that we are left with. It will be very difficult for Israel to have an outcome that is favorable to them, because each one of these is really problematic for Israel, and they've essentially put themselves in a box that they're going to have to figure out how to deal with and choose one of these three options. That dynamic is what now is taking place, and that then, as I said, ultimately changes the way that this conflict is viewed from the outside, as well as then how it's pursued by Israel, and ultimately the freedom and self-determination the Palestinians want ultimately will be something that will have to be granted to them, because nobody can continue to oppress a people decade after decade. History has shown us that, and it will be the case here as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for such an insightful review of the current situation. I'm hoping it would help people put things into perspective and kind of gauge what's happening currently in the conflict with a real life lens and not through whatever is being portrayed in the media. Thank you again. And it was lovely having you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.